Hey guys, this is Vernier for cardrunners.com, bringing you the 8th episode of Building Good Poker Study Habits. And today I want to talk about Matthew J. and his applications of No Limit Hold'em, specifically the introduction. So on my blog about developing 10 steps to more mindful poker from January 1st, I included a link to Matthew J. and his applications of No Limit Hold'em. So you can click on that. And as you can see, it takes you to Amazon, and you've got the book, and you can click look inside. And when you look inside, you can go and read the basics. So you can read the introduction to the basics. And that's what I'm going to go over. I'm going to go over some of the beginning of the book, some of the concepts Matthew talks about. And if you enjoy it, I would recommend that you order this book. I think it's a book that any serious poker player should have in their library. So, concept number one, there's 10 concepts that Matthew includes in the summary, and I'm going to go over them. Pot odds are a ratio of the current size of the pot to the cost of a potential call or bet. So, for example, here's a hand that I have with pocket kings. There is a raise and a re-raise, and I end up 3-betting. I wouldn't mind going bigger here, but I think this is okay. I get one call, check, and I bet 1250 into 25. So when I bet 1250 into 25, let's say I was bluffing, then 1250 divided by 1250, and that should be a plus. So my bet size here is 1250, and once I put that 1250 into the pot's 3750. So when I make that bet, when I make that half pot size bet, I only need the villain to be folding 33% of the time for my bet here to be a profitable continuation bet. And by profitable, I mean as a bluff. On the other hand, when he's calling, so he's calling 1250 to try to see another card, and so that's basically there's $50 in the pot. So he only needs 25% equity. He's getting 3-1 on the call here. My 1250, the 2 times 1250 in the pot, and then his 1250. So basically, you need much lower pot odds to call than you do to bet or raise, and I'm not even sure if I'm using bet or raise correctly here. But that's the general idea of pot odds. Number 2 is equity. Equity tells us the odds the hand will be best by the river against an opponent's hand or range. So, for example, bring this hand up again. He calls, I bet the turn, he check raises all in on the turn, and I call, and he has the ace-jack offsuit. So on the turn, when we get it all in, he has about 12% equity. Now, what if he didn't have ace-jack? So what if on that turn, I'm going to bring up poker tools. Well, so let's say he has ace-jack. The board is 5 of diamonds, jack of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 2 of hearts. And I have king of hearts, king of clubs. And I'm going to give him a range of ace-jack, let's say queens, jacks, 10s, see, yeah, and maybe like king queen suited. Actually, I'm going to take that out. So that's a range of hands that he can have, and against that range, I have, sorry, I figured out my typo. So here's the board, and here's my hand. And against that range of hands, I have 75.5% equity. So that's equity versus a range. Now the expected value, and this is something Matthew talks about how, in this case, it's pretty easy to calculate the expected value. My expected value here is, against this specific hand, I have 88% equity, and I multiply that by the size of the pot, and I expect to win $176. But Matthew cautions the readers that unless everybody is all in on the hand, it's very difficult you can't just multiply your equity by the size of the pot unless everybody's all in. Because a lot of people can take a lot of different lines, and the expected value calculation is actually more complicated than that. So I will leave that up to you to read the details of that. Concept number 4 says that hands with more equity are not necessarily better than hands with less equity. It's important that our hand retains its equity against our opponent's raising and calling ranges. And I think that's something that beginners make the biggest mistakes with early on. So let's look, for example, at a range of 4s through aces, some suited broadways, and some offsuit broadways. So let's say this is our opponent's range. And we have a hand like ace of diamonds, 9 of hearts, so an offsuit ace. That hand has 37% equity against our opponent's range. And now let's look at a hand like 7 of spades, 6 of spades. So that hand has 34.5% equity. So it's got lower equity. But what Matthew says is that this kind of a hand, and I think a lot of players intuitively understand this, a lot of winning players, I should say, intuitively understand this. The hand like ace of diamonds, 9 of hearts, a lot of its equity is against our opponent's like check folding range, where basically they miss the flop. Let's say they have like king queen and the flop comes ace high, and let's say they see bet once and then they don't continue. So a lot of the equity of a hand like ace of diamonds, 9 of hearts comes against our opponent's range, where our opponent's just not going to continue far with the hand. Whereas if we have 7 of spades, 6 of spades, a lot of the equity there is going to be against our opponent's value range. So let's say our opponent has an overpair or a top pair, top kicker, and we end up with a 2-pair or a straight or a flush. So we're a lot more likely to win big pots with our suited connectors than we are with a offsuit raggedy ace, even though the equity is different. Kind of along the same lines, concept number 5 says that hands simply cannot simply be ranked from strongest to weakest. Different hands perform better in different spots. So the example there is a hand like, I'm going to clear this. So for example, hands like small pocket pairs, 2s through 5s, or maybe even 6s, they do great in multi-way pots. Whereas these high suited broadways or offsuit broadways, basically high Broadway cards, they do much better in pots where it's just you and another opponent, so in heads-up pots. And realizing which kind of hand does better in what situation is very important. So you can't just say, well, ace-queen suited is better than pocket 2s. Well, it really depends on the situation. So concept number 6 talks about a polarized versus a polarized range versus what Matthew calls a condensed range, and other people have called a merged range. So an example of that is a range of, let's say, very strong. So here's a polarized range. Queens plus an ace king, and then a couple like suited aces and a couple suited connectors. So this is a range which does not include, has a lot of very strong hands and kind of some weaker hands, but really nothing in between. So a condensed range, the way, and I guess, I guess this is the difference between a merged. A merged range includes most things, but what Matthew defines as a condensed range is a lot of the kind of medium strength hands. So hands like King Queen, King Jack suited, eights through jacks would kind of be in the condensed range. And the point that he makes there is a betting or raising range is often polarized, and a calling range is often condensed. And I think this is a concept that's very important to understand, due to the way that you play your betting, the way you bet versus the way you call. And I think that when I see players when they show up with a condensed range in a situation where they're betting or raising, it's often surprising and points to a player that's not very experienced and probably going to be a losing player. Concept number 7 says that our betting range should almost always be polarized on the river. Our goal is to make our opponent indifferent, calling or bluffing. And a lot of this has to do with the game theory, and I think that's what a lot of the book is about. So I'm not going to go into the math here. This is just what the concept is, and I'd recommend that if you want to learn more about this, just read the book. Concept number 8, hands cannot always be classified as either a value bet or a bluff. This is especially true on the flop. And this is another very important concept. So for example, I have 9-10 suited here, and I raise and I get one caller. And the flop comes 3-4-10. And if I was to bet here, sometimes I fold out hands that have equity against me, like a king jack or an ace jack type hand. And that's great. But against hands that continue, if I bet, I'm usually not going to be doing so hot. So, am I betting for value here? Am I betting as a bluff? It's just not as simple. And Matthew goes into a lot more detail about this idea and gives a lot more examples. But just know that this is not as simple as I'm either betting for value or I'm betting as a bluff here. Even if I have a hand like ace jack here, then it's likely that I have some kind of equity against my opponent. Yeah, it's just an important thing to think about. Concept number 9, our opponent should often be close to indifferent between bluffing and folding. And again, that's not something that I'm going to go into detail about in this short video, but I recommend that you read about this in the book and start constructing ranges and playing around with things and coming up with this idea of having either you being indifferent or your opponent being indifferent to certain plays. And the last concept is that being in position provides many benefits that greatly increase the profitability of a player's range. And again, anyone that has played poker for a while intuitively understands this, but Matthew goes into this with more detail. So the general idea here is that being in position, we just have more information, and it's easier to control the size of the pot, and the deeper the stacks, the better position, the more helpful position is. So if you've got very small, like against a short stack, your position is not nearly as important. But if you're playing 100 plus big blinds deep, then it becomes quite important. So that's the summary of the 10 basic concepts in the introduction. Once again, I recommend that you go check this book out on Amazon.com, look through the preview, and if you feel like it's got some concepts that would help your game, I recommend that you pick it up. So for cardrunners.com, this has been Vernier. Good luck at the tables, guys.